Hey everybody, in this video I'm going to be talking about Stephen King's 1987 novel, The Eyes of the Dragon, and demonstrating what to look for when trying to identify a first US and first UK edition of the book. So the US first trade edition was published in 1987 by Viking. There was an original first limited edition published in 1984 by Stephen King's own Philtrum Press. That book is rare and quite valuable. This is the much more commonly found first trade edition from 1987. It's a very distinctive jacket, very lovely jacket, printed in red on green. There's the spine and the back cover. The first edition was published in a print run of 400,000 copies that all have this distinctive scaled pattern on the dust jacket. Pretty cool. There were later printings to meet the demand for this title, but if it doesn't have the scales, it's not a first edition. I have seen book club editions that have the scales on the outside of the jacket, which was a real surprise to me, but I'll go over the rest of the points to look for as well. So first thing to look for is the scaled jacket. Next thing is a price of $18.95. On the inside flap, green end papers. The Eyes of the Dragon, the book club edition that I saw that had the scaled jacket, had white end papers. So that was something that triggered to me that it wasn't an authentic first edition. Look for green end papers. And on the copyright page, to look for the language. First published in 1987 by Viking Penguin Incorporated. There will be no number line. That's what to look for. The book is pretty lavish for a trade edition, lavishly illustrated throughout by David Palladini. Some of this artwork is pretty famous in the Stephen King universe. Underneath the jacket, the book has green boards with a gold imprinted dragon on the front cover. Sort of a off-white cloth covering, green printing of the title, gold for Stephen King's name and the publisher. You can't tell, obviously, by watching this video, but the book is surprisingly heavy. It's very well produced. Like I said, lavish, especially for a trade edition. And it's referenced in here, which is also kind of unique for a trade edition, about noting the artwork and also the type of paper, Bien Fang velour paper. It has a real supple texture, and it's thicker, heavier, more deluxe feeling than your average paper in a trade hardcover. As far as the trade editions go, this, I have to say, is probably the nicest one. This was produced with just a higher eye to detail than your average trade hardcover edition. Anyway, it is, as far as trades go, it is a beautiful book, beautiful production, with a beautiful and iconic jacket that actually, ironically, has not a whole lot necessarily to do with the novel, despite the title, which kind of amuses me. Anyway, that's the first US trade edition. The first UK edition was published by MacDonald. There's the front jacket. Also has some nice effects the gold, reflective gold foil printing of the name Stephen, and of the title. Very nice jacket. Author photo on the back. It's pretty nice. Inside, look for a printed price of £10.95. And on the copyright page, look for first published in Great Britain in 1987. So there's your UK hardcover copyright page. This has the same content, the same illustrations as the US edition. You might be able to tell that, unfortunately, seemingly like all the 80s era UK trade editions, this was printed on slightly substandard paper. It's not as browned and tanned as some of the 80s books that I have and that I've seen, but nevertheless, there is still tanning going on there, especially in comparison to the US edition. So it's too bad. This book is not as heavy, not as deluxe feeling as the US edition, but it's still a decent representation of the story and the production. Underneath the jacket, black boards all around, and gold lettering on the spine. Pretty typical for UK editions, just one color all the way around. Eyes of the Dragon was originally published in 1984 by Stephen King's own boutique publishing imprint, Philtrum Press. So that was in a lettered edition of 52 copies, 26 that were lettered in red, 26 that were lettered in black, numbered edition of 250 copies in red ink, which I believe were for private distribution, I may be wrong, and a numbered edition of 1,000 copies numbered in black ink. It's really a lovely edition, oversized, very deluxe, and well worth looking up if you're not familiar with it. Checking out if you have deep pockets. It's another one of those, like everything Stephen King, seemingly over the last few years, that just continues to grow and grow in value. So it is well out of my reach, but it is still a lovely edition and well worth checking out. I have to admit, over my Stephen King reread and catch up, I've read a lot of Stephen King over the last few years. I'm trying to make my way through his entire back catalog, and I started at the beginning with the things that I hadn't read, and then I was working my way through chronologically, and I actually skipped past Eyes of the Dragon. It's one of the ones that I thought I just wasn't that excited about reading. I knew that he wrote it for his daughter because she complained that he never wrote anything that she would want to read. She was a teenager, I think 13, and so he wrote a novel that might be suitable for her to read or capture her interests. In that regard, in a sense, it carries this perception, at least in my head, that it's almost a YA novel, and I wouldn't exactly categorize it as YA. It's a step lower in the adult content ladder than just your pretty much run-of-the-mill Stephen King, but it still has some more adult and more challenging content. I think I no doubt it would be popular among young people, like a lot of Stephen King's works are. I was not looking forward necessarily to reading it, and I was incredibly pleasantly surprised by the story. Once I sort of got over the fantasy, sword and sorcery type of idea that I had about the novel, I was really drawn in, and I thought that it was a really interesting stylistic exercise. When I read Stephen King, he has sort of this incredibly natural voice, and more often than not, right out of the gate, it's like you open the curtains in a house you've never been in, and you look out the window and to a yard you've never looked out, and you just sort of go through the window into that other world. It's smooth and it's seamless, and I always thought that that was just Stephen King's voice. And so to read a novel where he very purposefully adopts a different voice as a stylistic exercise is really impressive. There's a lot of himself as the narrator, as a guide, as a character, almost like in theater where the chorus, I think that's the right word, the chorus, the person that comes on stage and sort of comments on the action and guides the plot along. Stephen King sort of acts as that role in this novel, which I found really interesting. And okay, so big time spoiler alert to come. I doubt anyone is watching this video if you have not read The Eyes of the Dragon, or you're not at least familiar with it. But as much as I was familiar with this cover, as fairly iconic as it is in the Stephen King universe, it's beautiful. There's no doubt about it. But this image gave me the impression that the book would be full of dragons and knights and, swords, and they're fighting dragons. Really, okay, big time spoiler alert. So stop now or fast forward if you don't want to hear this. The dragon is barely in it. The dragon he makes a brief appearance in the beginning. He's dispatched by the king, and so the dragon does play a role. The eyes of the dragon are important, but it could be anything. It could have been the eyes of the muskox. It could have been the eyes of the ermine, the eyes of, it could have been the eyes of anything, because the eyes of the dragon are actually hidden portals for people to look through to see into the king's chambers and to spy on him. So in that sense, the UK cover is a much more relevant and applicable cover image, because really the king's advisor flag is, well, maybe he's not the main character. He's certainly the main antagonist of the book, and the dragon hardly has anything to do with it. So while this is no doubt one of the most beautiful trade covers in the Stephen King canon, this is, I think, a much more applicable and relevant cover to the book. Okay, so spoiler alert is over. I found it really interesting. I haven't read the Dark Tower series since the last three were released 2003, so almost 20 years ago. I finished the Dark Tower series, and I haven't read Wind Through the Keyhole when it was released, but the main 7 books I haven't read in about 20 years. And there's a really interesting kind of mysterious alternate Dark Tower reality connection that the Eyes of the Dragon has. So certainly if you're a fan of the Dark Tower series, I would read it first, and then if you want to read all the myriad other books that sort of tie into the Dark Tower series, Eyes of the Dragon would be a great first place to start. It shares very important main character, seemingly in an alternate reality, alternate dimension, perhaps an earlier, far earlier time frame than what is when the Dark Tower series actually takes place. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that Roland, the main character of the Dark Tower series, references the kingdom of Delane, which is where the Eyes of the Dragon takes place, which does indicate that they are from the same world, the same universe, and not alternate realities. And perhaps, I don't know, it's interesting. The mythology around the Dark Tower series is depthless, labyrinthine, and kind of overwhelming to try to unpack. But you don't have to have read the Dark Tower series to enjoy the Eyes of the Dragon. It is an interesting and unique standalone experience. So for me, I was more drawn to Stephen King because of the horror and that aspect of his writing, and so was not super drawn to the Eyes of the Dragon. Really glad that I read it. I'm a fan. I feel bad that I assumed so much sort of negative about it, and then I put off reading it for so long. But I can see it as a great place to start for an adventurous young person who is curious about Stephen King, somebody who really enjoys fantasy and Dungeons and Dragons and swordplay and wizards and magic, and they're not really into horror. They might find the Eyes of the Dragon a really interesting sort of entryway into the Stephen King universe. But I mean, really, he's a master storyteller, and so I've said it before, I'll say it again, I've never read a bad Stephen King book. Some I would consider sort of middle of the road. They're not classic. Other ones are classic. Some are iconic. Eyes of the Dragon is a really solid read, and it's really different and unique and sticks out in the Stephen King bibliography, and I think in a good way. So if you, for some reason, if you haven't read it, if you're like me and you have some preconceived notions about what it is and you don't think you'd be interested in it, I recommend that you give it a shot. It's not a particularly long novel. It reads quickly, and it's a good story. So anyway, US edition, UK edition, both well worth looking up, despite the fact of the arguable, debatable relevance of this cover as opposed to this cover. The US first trade edition is a beautiful book and really a remarkable piece of production for a major printing house, a major publisher for a trade hardcover release. And if you can only get one, or if you want to start with one and then look for the other, this would be the one to start with. Often on the spine, the lettering is faded. That's very common. So you might see it where it almost looks white or pink. Anyway, some various stages of fading from the red. But this copy I was very excited to find. The red looks really nice. That's pretty typical. If you're going to find wear and tear, that's a really typical place to find it. The jacket is glossy and it's nice paper, but the book is a little bit heavier I found that the jacket is prone to chipping and wear. This jacket has a couple of spots on the back, but otherwise is in nice shape. So I was really pleased to track this down. And then I always had my eye out for the UK edition, and I found it on, I think, Biblio or Abe Books, one of those, for like 20 bucks, 25 bucks, and it's in great shape too. So I'm glad to have the two that I added to my collection. But anyway, thank you as always for your time. I hope you have a great rest of your day wherever you are, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.